Thank you very much. Now we start session 5, the choke points in the Indo-Pacific, the Taiwan Strait, East and South China Seas, and the Korean Peninsula. We will begin now. Let me introduce the panelist and the moderator. Moderator is Dr. Joshua Walker, and speakers are Professor Victor Cha, Mr. Justin Hayhurst, Ambassador Park Chol-hee, and Ms. Joa Wu. For their more information on their bio, please look at the pamphlet.
どうもありがとうございました。これからちょっと英語で頑張
I would like to try myself and put myself together to speak in English.
in English at the Global Dialogues, and it is great to be here in Tokyo. This is a really exciting panel. I think everyone on the panel is a little nervous about what could be said about the intersection of domestic politics and foreign policy in the Indo-Pacific. And if you look at the title, we have pretty much put every possible problem there could be in the Indo-Pacific as a choke point. So I don't expect the panel is going to be able to answer every single question, and like the panel before us, we may raise more questions. But I hope that in the spirit of the 6th annual Tokyo Global Dialogues, we can talk about things a little differently here in Tokyo than where we have each come from in different ways. And of course, when you have ambassadors that are serving and academics and scholars who are watching, we'll have a great interaction here. So let me just kick off with the kind of opening remarks for each of the speakers to kind of think about how they think about these choke points, the risks, and where you're coming from. So Victor, let me come to you. You're coming in from Washington. There's something that's been going on over the last couple of weeks in Washington. Everybody's interested in that. But before we get to that part, how do you see the key word here, choke points and the Indo-Pacific from the perspective sitting in Washington?
Well, thanks, Josh.
You don't have to do anything, just.
Thank you, Josh. I guess the caveat is I didn't actually come directly from Washington. I came from Hawaii, where I just managed not to be in Washington during the inauguration. But of course, everybody's watching things very carefully. So I think, the choke points are all very familiar to us as laid out in the agenda for the program. To me, the real question is how much leadership and changes of leadership affect the potential for these choke points to stabilize or to blow up, and also more broadly, the environment in which we think about U.S. policy vis-a-vis these choke points. So just to get us started, a couple of things. The first is that I think even though we have 4 years of a Trump administration that has just started, I think effectively we will see some of the biggest changes coming in the first half of the Trump administration. If for no other reason that the electoral calendar makes it such that the first 18 to 24 months is really the point at which the administration has all levers of government arguably under their control before the midterm elections, where I think it's fairly safe to assume they could lose the House. So I think we could see a lot of activity in the beginning. Right now, most of it is focused on domestic issues, the border, immigration, woke agenda, things like that. But I think it could certainly move to foreign policy. And here, I guess I'll make 4 quick points. The first is that we should pay close attention to how the framework of ending the war in Ukraine impacts the other choke points. I think in the past we've looked at these largely as these choke points relate to the Indo-Pacific or sub-regionally Southeast Asia or Northeast Asia, but there is an overarching imperative and a promise by the United States to end this war in Ukraine, and that could arguably affect how the United States thinks about specific policy issues with regard to choke point countries in Asia, like the DPRK and like China. The second broader point is that there's no denying that President Trump has a different view of allies and partners and their utility. We tried to sum this up, and it's an academic exercise, so admittedly people can poke holes in it, but we tried to sum up the way Trump looks at allies and partners in terms of two metrics. One of them is the percentage of GDP spent on national defense, and then whether that particular Indo-Pacific or European ally or partner has a trade surplus or deficit with the United States. And so those, as you would imagine, those countries, those allies and partners in Europe and Asia that spend less, we use 3%. I know Trump has now raised it to 5%, but we use 3%. Those allies and partners that are spending less than 3% and that run a trade deficit, a trade surplus with the United States are the ones that he is going to really want to try to enact some change on. And not to make any ally or partner feel uncomfortable, but I can say that you're all in the same boat because there is actually only one NATO ally that passes that metric. It's Latvia, that has a trade deficit with the United States and spends more than 3% of GDP on defense. And there's only one Indo-Pacific ally that meets one of those metrics, and that is Australia, which runs a trade deficit with the United States. Everybody else runs a trade surplus. So, you know, I think that you know, I'm not trying to sort of essentialize our allied and partners' policies. I think there will be a lot of continuity there, but I also think that there will be change and some fundamental change. And it does raise the question of, when we think about choke points, how well allies and partners within a region or across regions can cooperate in ways multilaterally, plurilaterally, in terms of dealing with some of these choke points in a period where we could see American consolidation of power. And I think it's a very important question. And then finally, just because it's an area that I spend a lot of time on, to me, I don't think it was listed, one of the choke points that's not listed in the agenda is the DPRK-Russia relationship. That is something when this past year, I've actually spent more time in Brussels than I have in Asian capitals, just because the Europeans want to talk a lot about DPRK-Russia. It has fundamentally changed aspects of the war in Ukraine. It has changed the way Europeans look at Asian security. They talk more about this than they talk about Taiwan now, even though the conversation on Taiwan in Europe has become much more advanced. The DPRK-Russia one is, I think, animating a lot of their conversations in large part because they don't see a solution. It's hard to identify a solution. And perhaps the only solution to that particular problem is through some sort of deal on Ukraine. That may be the only way to do that, which would fundamentally change the way the United States would be looking at the North Korea problem. Not in the context of CVID, but in the context of not CVID or denuclearization, but in the context of the war, trying to end the war in Ukraine. And that would be a big shift. So let me stop there.
Great, thank you. You've laid a lot on the table. Ambassador, picking up right where Victor left off, Australia seems to be in a better place. I was in Washington for the inauguration, and I was very heartened to see the very first meeting that the first appointed cabinet secretary, Marco Rubio, had was with the Quad leaders. And you had the Japanese, the Australian, and the Indian foreign ministers there, kind of immediately picked up right where things left off, whereas some of the other things in the world, from Paris Climate Accords to others, there's been a kind of a sea change, so to speak. So how are you feeling? How are you thinking about this here in Tokyo as you watch the broader choke points and think about the Indo-Pacific, of which Australia is one of those key areas?
Thank you, Joshua. I feel pretty good, actually. Thank you for asking. The Quad meeting in Washington was a good and encouraging and very clear start, a good signal of intent from the administration, and a mark, I think, of seriousness towards the big strategic challenges in the Indo-Pacific. You know, it's interesting, the subject of this panel, choke points, I tend to think of them myself more as fault lines in a way, because, you know, there are two, if we think of the Indo-Pacific as a regional order, there are always two big things that concern Australia. One of them is the balance of power, of course, how power is distributed, and that's clearly changed massively in recent years and probably will continue to change. So there are many manifestations of that, the most obvious of which is the size and strength and reach of China's economy, but it also comes to the fore in China's military modernization, which has changed the game for national defense in the Indo-Pacific. So the power, how it's distributed, and in our case, how it's balanced, right? So that's one thing. The second thing that really matters, and this is why I think fault lines is my way of thinking about these particular international issues, is the rules of the game, how the region actually works. So, is it international law or some negotiated agreement or treaty, or is it just brute force that resolves a particular problem or issue or dispute between countries? And the outlook in the period ahead is pretty clear on one front. I think power is going to become more important, part of the equation. And I think one change in the Indo-Pacific that's not often thought about or talked about is that individual countries that are not the United States and China are investing more in their own national power because they're going to need to hedge against a much higher risk of conflict. And the power balance is changing. So there's a major defence uplift in Japan, and there's a major defence uplift in Australia and in many other countries. So that's a change. What's less clear is how the region's going to work. And that'll be a challenge, I think, for the foreign policy of many nations. And the Quad, for example, has always been about both, actually. It's not just who sets the agenda, it's what the agenda is, right? And that's the foreign policy task that I think matters to Australia. And if you think of the fundamental function of foreign policy, which is, to give a state the most options, choices, and room for manoeuvre in an international system, those two things working together have always mattered the most. Now, the regions or flashpoints or choke points we're talking about today, all of them, both of those issues, the power balance and the way issues are resolved, come together. I think the big challenge for the region is how to make progress on those without miscalculation and conflict, because that's the big difference in my career, which is 25, 26, 27 years old in government service, is the risk of high intensity conflict between major powers is now like a tangible thing rather than a very abstract concept. And we're only just learning to adjust to that. So I think, for this panel, let's have a think about the power balance and what it means, including on the issues that you've identified, and let's think about the rules of the road, how the region works, and there's been a lot less talked about. So our policy has always been premised on we don't want raw power alone to be the determinant of outcomes in the Indo-Pacific. Just by way of conclusion, if I may, I do want to, Dr. Cha, Victor's point about Russia and the Russia-Ukraine and the outcome of that. I think that's going to be a very important variable in the period ahead. One of many big shifts in recent years has been the much closer alignment between China and Russia. But the full import of that in the Indo-Pacific obviously is yet to be felt when so much attention is to Russia's west rather than east. So I look forward to what my panelists have to say about those issues as well. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Ambassador Park, I will ask you how you're doing, but also the dynamics of the Korean Peninsula have dramatically changed in the last couple of months because of the dynamism of the Korean democracy. America thought we had an exciting election. I think Japan has thought some of its politics have been unusual, but you take the cake for us. And so I guess the question I would ask for you, particularly sitting here in Tokyo, where in many ways the last couple of years, where the U.S.-Japan-Korea relationship has been so critical, and certainly the relationship between Korea and Japan has been so important and in a positive sense, which I think has heartened many of us, not just the United States, but the private sector, to be able to look to the future and not simply to the past. And so I guess as you think about the choke points, obviously the Korean Peninsula is the one that is closest to home, but it also might be the one that is one of the more challenging to talk about. How do you see the world as you watch what's happening back in Seoul, as you have to deal with the consequences here in Tokyo?
Thank you. First, let me say that all I say today is my personal opinion. My government did not push me to the stage, and my embassy staff did not prepare any talking points for me. So this was my personal opinion in that sense. And I think before we begin talk about the Korean Peninsula issue, I think we have to put all this issue in the historical and strategic context. For a long time, possibly since 1979, this region, the Asia-Pacific region, didn't have a great war, no civil war, not big disturbances in the security sense. We had a relatively long peace in this region, but it's turning to be a relatively unstable. As time goes by, tensions are growing. I think because of two things combined. One is that U.S.-led international order is under challenge. So U.S. remained as a dominant power and security provider in the region. But what we call great power rivalry began again. So there's a challenger against the kind of hegemonic power. That's coming with a kind of a new development of the loose ties among countries like China, Russia, North Korea, and Iran. I don't think they share exactly the same national interest, but they share one thing in common. They wanted to create a multipolar world rather than unipolar system. So shaking the US-led international order is in their interest, in a sense that if you come to have a multipolar world, they have more room to maneuver among those countries. I don't think they will dominate the whole region, but they at least more breathing space and more room to maneuver on their part. So that's the reason why we have a kind of increasing stability in the region. And I completely agree with Justin in a sense that rather than choke point, that's the fault line. The fault lines are located in the Western Pacific Rim, starting from the Korean Peninsula, Taiwan Strait, East China Sea, the South China Sea, because it's the kind of contact point between the U.S.-led the camp and then the China, Russia, North Korea, the coalition. So it's not strange at all that we find the fault lines are formed along this line. And then I think we have to put ourselves in that bigger strategic context when you talk about all these changes in the regional security issues. Having said that, I would say that many people are much more focused on U.S.-China rivalry and then potential crisis in the Taiwan Strait. But from the Korean perspective, I'm not necessarily narrow-minded or just focusing on the Korean Peninsula only. But we don't have to exaggerate the threats coming from North Korea. But we should never underestimate the threats coming from North Korea. In several senses, and especially from the Korean perspective, North Korea is an immediate and present challenge that we have to face at all times. So that's why Korea is spending much more defense expenditure than any other countries in this region. The North Korea, as you can see, is developing its military capability very rapidly, in a very sophisticated manner, especially nuclear and missile capability. That goes beyond the defensive capability. They say that that's for defense, but I doubt it. If it's just for the defense of North Korea, I don't think they have reason to develop ICBM style the missile or supersonic missiles because they can defend their country with other kind of weapon systems. But they're giving, by developing nuclear and the missile capability, it's not just threatening ROK, Japan, but the United States and other the regional neighbors. So this is a kind of serious security threat to the region and the world. Furthermore, their military doctrine is getting more and more assertive. As you know, North Korea is not giving up the kind of the potential use of nuclear power in times of contingencies, which is very surprising. If it is a kind of real defensive measures, you don't have to declare that you can use a nuclear weapon in times of contingencies or other occasions. So they are developing military doctrines that are going beyond just a kind of defending their own country. As Victor and Justin said, the enhancing military cooperation between North Korea and Russia, this is a daunting challenge, not just to this region. The North Korea itself, they proved that the European security and the security in this region is directly linked. It's not indirect or suppose they're linked. It's a kind of a direct linkage in a sense that they are dispatching their soldiers to Russia to attack Ukraine, and then possibly they will receive something in return. And they have a practical training in the combat field, and they will come back to many will die, but many will come back to North Korea, which is a serious challenge for us. So this should not be neglected, and this should be watched much more carefully and what's going on. I think there is a kind of a rumor that North Korea is likely to dispatch more soldiers to Russia in the future. So we have to watch out. And then this is not a kind of just a promise to cooperate. This is a real cooperation. And then what if there's a Korean contingency and then Russia dispatches soldiers to North Korea? We have to be very much alert about the potential challenges we may be facing in this region. And it is needless to say that North Korea is ignoring UN Security Council resolutions and avoiding trying to get over the sanctions imposed on them through various means, not just one. So this creates a kind of a very serious challenges, not only just to my country, ROK, but to Japan and other countries in the region. So I think rather than just focusing on only one point in the fault line, we have to have a comprehensive view of the kind of choke point or flash points in this region, and the possibility about the linking one or two at the same time. That's much more daunting challenge we have to face now and in the future. And having said that, finally, I wanted to add up that Korea is not necessarily focused on the Korean Peninsula issue only. As you can see, under the Union administration, we have proactively declared a Indo-Pacific strategy to engage Korea to the whole region in order to keep the free and open the international order in this region. So I will elaborate it later. Thank you.
Thank you. You've set the table nicely for Wu Sensei. It's very difficult to follow the areas, and your area of responsibility being a Chinese national in Japan studying these issues, it puts you in a very difficult spot as the world looks at that relationship. So I invite you to give us your perspective, given that you have been studying these issues for such a long time, and uniquely from a Japanese point of view, but also trying to understand how China may be thinking about these things, particularly from a timeline point of view. So please, we invite your perspective.
名前からして日本
You can tell that I'm not a Japanese, and I'm the only person speaking in Japanese on this panel, which may sound unique. I have spent many years each in Japan, China, and the US, and I'm now based in Japan. And Japan is the country where I have been living for the longest period of time among the three countries I have just mentioned. Previous panelists pointed out that we are now going through a change of fundamental nature. It is a chaos of sort, I would say. At the same time, I am a China researcher, and I have also researched Sino-US relations. And from my academic experience, I am in a position to take this fundamental change as something that is of positive nature. Today's theme is this specific region, and this also has a close connection to that theme as well. The reason I can take this fundamental change in a positive manner is as follows. There is a major division in the US, and the Trump administration is viewed from many different angles. But one of a revolutionary development is going through within the framework of democracy. And the recent affairs in this region also has a international order that has been created after World War II, and that has also started crumbling or collapsing. One of the factors contributed to the collapse was China, definitely. The post-war international order created by the US and other European countries have democracy that is fundamentally different from what is being pursued by China. And with the rise of China, democracy-based ideology has come to suffer some dysfunctionality. Someone mentioned DeepSeek, and what has been a factor that has enabled DeepSeek outcome? We are yet to find an ultimate answer to that question, but I would surmise that traditional norm-based open source and other framework was used cleverly in trying to develop DeepSeek. This set of values or ideology are fundamentally different in these countries that are now becoming major players. So we definitely need a change. We are currently in a situation where a war could happen. We are yet to have a war, but we are already in a chaos. So I am taking a look at this from a positive vantage point. And a chaos that we are going through, what has contributed to this chaos? Rather than a short-lived structural issues, I believe that it is a longer-term structural factors that has contributed to the start of this chaos. If it is a structural factor, then I would believe that conventional method of thinking would not suffice in trying to formulate a response. So that is the reason that I look forward to further development and discussion on this topic. This is the greatness of Tokyo Global Dialogue, because Japanese speaker, the speech was made in Japanese in a conversation between American and Chinese participants.
So please do send those on so I can see them. Victor, picking up right where everyone has left off, you made this really important point about how you've been watching Korea and DPRK, but now seeing DPRK deployed in Ukraine, and we heard from the Korean ambassador what that could mean in terms of exporting chaos back, or that kind of capability back. Some might say that that's also what's happening in our domestic politics, where you talked about the first couple of weeks of the Trump administration, very internally focused, very domestic focused. The intersection between the domestic politics, where in the short term thinking and transactionalism of interest, that might supersede the international rules-based system that has led the last 80 years and the values that alliances have had. You use the statistics of the deficit and spending. How do you think about those pieces? Our elections is over. That's settled, you said, for at least the 18 to 24 months with the midterms. What can we think about during that period of time? And given all of this change, what's your advice to those of us who are watching this and trying to understand how to manage those choke points and those key areas for consideration we're discussing?
It's a great question. It's a great question, Josh, and I don't know if my answer can do justice to the question. I think that certainly one of the areas that all the countries will be wrestling with, despite their domestic preoccupations, is what Ambassador Hayhurst started out with, was this whole question of rules of the road, governance. Is it just unmitigated power competition that will define everything in international relations? We clearly see an effort at that in the middle of Europe that has been taking place. And I think it is an open question about, I think there are two open questions. One is, what's going to be the United States role under a Trump administration in sort of playing that role in bolstering global governance institutions, continuing to push forward with things like the G7, Camp David, AUKUS, all the sort of multilaterals. And to me, I mean, there's one question, but the sub-question to that is how much of the United States role is going to be about participating versus practicing. And so by that, I mean participating meaning, sure, we'll go to the meetings. But by practicing, I mean we're going to go to the meetings and we're going to practice. We're going to do the exercising. We're going to do the ballistic missile defense exercises. We're going to do the ASW exercises. We're going to do all these other things, that, frankly speaking, cost money. And at least in the first Trump administration, there was a lot of talk about, like, exercising was provocative and expensive and not necessary. So yeah, certainly participating, but practicing to me is still an open question, at least based on some of the things we saw in the first term. The second is with regard to Ukraine. I mean, there was clearly a promise that was made by the president that he would end the war within 24 hours, and we've been more than 24 hours, but I still do think that that is a high priority for the administration. And I think we really have to think about how what the United States may see as necessary to ending the war will naturally bleed into equities in the U.S.-China relationship, as well as DPRK Russia, in the sense that part of ending that war will mean some sort of deal with regard to China and the industrial support they're providing to Russia. And with DPRK, the munitions, we've seen these calculations that say, the North Koreans have profited like somewhere between $2.5 to $6.5 billion off of this war, and we're not even counting the technology transfer that could be happening. So I think it causes us to look at these traditional choke points potentially in a very different way than we've looked at it before. And then the last point, I just want to pick up where Ambassador Park left off on North Korea and concerns about North Korea's strategic doctrine changing. I mean, we actually, so when I was doing six-party talks, when Ambassador Sasai was the head of the Japanese delegation when we were doing six-party talks, rarely did we talk about a North Korea first use doctrine. I don't think it even ever came up as a North Korea first use doctrine. But we ran at CSIS, we ran a language data scraping exercise, look at coding sort of North Korean statements and coding them as being either deterrence versus offense oriented. And the long and the short of it is that there has been a shift from talking about nuclear weapons purely as deterrence and talking about them more as offensive weapons, right? And so that's very concerning. That's a shift. That was something that we never saw in six-party talks. And so I agree with Ambassador Park. We shouldn't hype the North Korean threat, but we should certainly not underestimate it.
Thank you. Ambassador, going to a less pleasant topic perhaps, you have an election coming up, which always makes your job very difficult to try to focus on the big picture when maybe things back on the home front are focused on the kind of economic issues and the issues that are less, focused on the fault lines. I'm curious how you think about, given your long career in foreign policy, but also thinking about in this particularly unique moment where, to use your terminology, fault lines, the thing that scares me about fault lines are they lead to earthquakes, right? And the tectonic plates that are shifting. And if I'm in Australia and I'm trying to navigate the balance of power that you laid out, the intersection and the timing of this election sometime in April or May, I guess that might be, how does that play into your calculus? How do you kind of hedge and balance with all the major priorities, the symmetry, the global politics that will continue onward?
Thank you. Well, I think the election in Australia, won't be about foreign policy. You'll be surprised to learn, and it's not really about Indo-Pacific strategic issues. My broad judgment, and this is, I'm speaking here unlike Ambassador Park, I think in my own professional capacity, but not about the Australian election. I do think the reality is, because the changes in the region are so obviously structural and profound and bear on the situation of the nation and the context in which it finds itself, there is likely to be a lot of continuity about broad settings. So, for example, trying to strengthen the alliance with the United States under the Trump administration in a way that works with the priorities of the Trump administration is an obvious priority for a US ally, and that will be the case regardless of which party wins the election. Thinking about Indo-Pacific security and Indo-Pacific partnership building with Japan, a very big priority. I'm extremely confident that will be a point of continuity on policy. The vital importance of Indonesia to Australia's security and position in the region will remain. Thinking about the strategic situation of the Southwest Pacific, which is a region that's important in its own right, but vital for the sea lines of communication that Australia has with other partners, principally the United States. So all these are sort of national challenges. There can be points of nuance and difference, but the fundamental tasks, I think, of Australian policy, which are about influence and shaping and using whatever agency a country our size has at a time of real change. So I anticipate a busy agenda that will look a lot like the current agenda, because the current agenda reflects judgments that both of the main parties in Australia have made about the import of the changes in the world for Australia's security. And it is going to be difficult in the period ahead. I think the days of easy foreign and defence policy choices are over. There's a lot more to the world than just US-China, but it's complicated. I mean, neither of the biggest powers is really a status quo power. So, there's definitely change coming. And again, because the outcome is a little bit uncertain, you can't just narrowly look for advantage in the way the system is now. You've got to think about where it's going and how to influence the landing point, whatever that might be. Thank you.
Thank you. Ambassador Park, you talked about the role that Korea has beyond just the Korean Peninsula, the impact. You know, we're talking about the Indo-Pacific. When it was originally put together as the Quad, Korea was not a part of it. But Korea has been very strategic in leveraging all of its levers of power. We've talked a lot about hard power on this stage, but I think particularly coming from the US, Korea has enormous soft power. So no matter what's happening in Seoul with your politics, K-pop continues onward, Korean culture continues to march on with its soap operas and others. I guess I kind of want to ask you about, given the dynamics of what's going on inside of Korea, but also given the uncertainty that we just heard about the fault lines, how do you kind of balance with whatever the Constitutional Court will do, how the election process and the politics inside, how do you kind of take the great British axiom of keep calm and carry on in terms of Korean foreign policy in a time of such uncertainty?
Yeah. Between Victor and me, we have a hidden agreement that if there is any question related to the Korean domestic politics, we will shift it over to Victor. So I will refrain from commenting on domestic political situation. But first of all, when we developed very friendly and cooperative ties with Japan under the current administration, there was a kind of a strategic thinking behind. It's not just a kind of emotional or historical things. One is that Korea and Japan have a kind of a joint security conception that we have to defend it together. Of course, freedom, democracy, rule of law kind of things. So we have lots in common. So Korea and Japan are not the only countries that we can do. We can do it with Australia and other countries in the region. So the kind of common the platform we share is the kind of the reason why we develop the good ties with Japan, and then keeping the Indo-Pacific region free and open, and then keep more the open trading system in the region. That serves our national interest. That serves Japan's interest and Korea's interest at the same time. So, and furthermore, if the kind of the international law is violated, like we see in Ukraine or in Middle East or some other areas, we are in deep trouble. So how to keep a kind of rules-based international order is critically important. So which country we can work together? So the starting point should be Japan. On the part of Korea. That's the reason why we have developed the very amicable ties with Japan, and that is extended to the kind of maintaining a stability and peace in the whole region. That's the thing. And then after we are facing the Trump administration now, and I don't want to comment on the individual policies, but I just wanted to provide a kind of so-called food for thought for all of us when we deal with the new situation. One is that we have to keep in mind that any short-term decision or deal have a long-term strategic effects. So if they just make a kind of a one-time deal, and without considering a longer-term effects, we can make the misjudgment. For example, okay, we don't like kind of the forward deployment of U.S. forces here. Pull back. Pull back is easier, but bringing them back to this region is very, very difficult. So that's just one example. So raising the trade wall. Yes, that makes sense in the short term, but if there is a reciprocal measures, then it will turn into a kind of very closed circle, which hampers a free transactions among nations. So we have to we think about the longer term effect of the short term decision. And second, do we really want to go back to the past? As we all know, the post-World War II international order is based on avoiding three bad practices of the 1930s and 40s, which are nationalism, protectionism, and populism. So to what extent can you accept those symptoms coming back? We have lots of symptoms in many countries, not in a single country. So how to manage this temper is critically important. I think some symptoms are unavoidable, but we have to control the temper and level of accepting nationalism, protectionism, and then populism in any country. Finally, we are all talking about great power rivalry, and in the middle, what is forgotten is Kitaoka Sensei is here, always talking about the importance of taking care of the global South. So rather than just talking about the big powers and power game, I think in the international order, the legitimate game is very important. How to get trust and respect from other countries matters a lot. So we shouldn't be mired into a kind of only U.S.-China competition and then Russia-China things, but how to take care of all this global South altogether. I think in that sense, Korea and Japan have lots of things to take care of the global South together. So we have lots of strategic interest in common. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. I'll be coming to the audience for questions after this to continue. I have so many more, but Wu Sensei, you basically said you have a pretty positive outlook and you have a positive attitude, which I think is desperately needed based on some of the reality checks that we just heard about. The elephant in the room in many ways is not just the Republican Party that's taken over Washington, it's also the relationship between our leaders. And while China may not have free and open elections, and it may not be part of the free and open Indo-Pacific, there are domestic politics in China. And we've watched the economy. You mentioned the DeepSeek and kind of the way in which people are frustrated about the technology being used. This does seem to be entering a space where it's not just about nation states, it's also about individual leaders. It's about society, open societies, closed society, free and open markets, closed markets. How do you think about how China-U.S. relations will evolve and the players that are in there, and how a country like Japan and the areas that we're talking about could be flashpoints, choke points, fault lines for the future?
Well, in conclusion, I'd like to start from a conclusion. At least I think in the short term, in this region where we are discussing this area, we are talking about Taiwan contingency and East China Sea. And for those inherent issues, I think the risk would be declining. For collision risk is going to be declining. As I mentioned before, China, Xi Jinping, how he is viewing the situation. And most of the policies in China are decided by him. And what's happening in the U.S. right now probably is going to have a great impact on Xi Jinping's leadership. It's going to bring a shock to Xi Jinping's leadership. And probably Trump administration, from the Western side, the view might be a little bit different. But when we look at Trump administration, they are close to the right. And China, inside and outside of China, they are looking at the United States, and they are thinking that U.S. is coming back to the traditional power. So liberalism should make the U.S. weaker. And then Xi Jinping is saying that the East is going to be stronger and the West is going to decline. That's part of his rhetoric. The U.S. is really in the upheaval. And after Mr. Trump was elected, immediately China said that if Mr. Trump is going to be successful, we'll have to really watch and we'll have to be very careful. This kind of thinking is arising. So for a while, for a Taiwan issue, and also right now, China is actively trying to get closer to Japan. So at least in a short period of time, they
are going to have to be more prudent. And accordingly, this region tension is going to decline. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for waiting. Now we'd like to receive questions from the floor. And I was at Tokyo University, and I learned how to raise hands to speak up. So we have questions from online as well. Kitaoka Sensei, please.
JICA and Tokyo University. I just would like to ask a question to Jovi and Victor. Now the DPRK is joining to Russia. It's terrible, and it's a big threat to us. And also they are accumulating the missile technology, nuclear technology. That's awful. And then there's a possibility that President Trump may recognize North Korea as a nuclear power. Then, in that sense, the security for North Korea is perfect in that sense. Then what's next? Then probably Kim Jong-un has to find out the next goal. Probably this is to make people a little bit happier or a little bit richer than from today. Then this is a real challenge for them. We have to prepare. We have to continue our, deterrence. We have to. That may need many years to come, but still, for them, what's next for North Korea? If they try to start the effort to make people a little bit more comfortable, then both the situation is similar to Russia and China, but still, one big difference is that, in the south of DPRK, there's a country which consists of the same people and much richer. And then this may start a big change to the North Koreans. Therefore, this is, I don't know how long it will continue, but actually this is a time of patience. We have to continue our deterrence against them. But, they may face another difficulty in the next situation.
Great, thank you. Before we answer the question, I see Bill over here and I see two over here. So let me get those and we'll come back to the panelists. Bill, please.
Thank you, Joshua. My question is about another fault line, the Philippines, the South China Sea. Country, Philippines, that Japan has been getting very close to, supplying Coast Guard vessels and so forth. Philippines is in confrontation with China on a daily basis. If I was advising Xi Jinping how to test the new Trump administration, I wouldn't advise him to do something with Taiwan. I wouldn't advise him to do something elsewhere. I would say the Philippines is where you might test the resolution and activity of the Trump administration. How do you see the panel see the confrontation in the Philippines evolving, and how do you see America's support for the Philippines evolving?
Great. I see two next generation folks over here, so let's go right back here and we'll take the other one and then we'll come back to the panel, please.
Thank you very much for the presentations. My name is Matsunaga from Chiba University, and I'm majoring in international relations and political science. I have one question to Ambassador Hayhurst and one same question to Dr. Chan, Ambassador Dr. Park. Now, to Ambassador Hayhurst, I'd like to ask your own opinion or Australian government's reaction to Trump's threatening Canada, which is the other side of Pacific and close ties with Australia and fellow member of British Commonwealth. And then next, same question to Dr. Chan and Dr. Park is that both South Korea and the United States have been placing importance between the collaboration between academics and policymakers, and that's why you two are having an important post in the government. But the Trump administration is going just opposite direction. So my question would be, how do you see Trump's such kind of attitude, any effect to foreign policy, especially between the Academy of IR? Thank you.
Great. Can you hand the microphone right over here to the gentleman with the glasses, and then we'll come back, please.
Thank you. My name is Kanishk, and I'm from Chatham House, London. I'd like to ask the panelists about the multilateral groupings in the Indo-Pacific, so the Quads, the trilaterals, as they could fundamentally change the regional architecture in many ways. So what are the motivations of the respective countries to take part or even lead these groupings and the desired impact of these groupings in the region? Is there like a broader vision behind this, or is it more like a patchwork to see what works in the region depending on the changes and where it goes from there? Thank you.
Great. I'm just going to go down the order that we spoke in, take the questions that either were referenced to you or you want to address, and I'll have you guys respond. I'll start with you, Victor.
So, Kitaoka Sensei's question, I think it's, and the media, particularly in South Korea, has picked up on Trump's use of the term nuclear power when he described North Korea. In my own mind, I don't know whether that was intentional or not. But I'm leaning in the direction of, like, Trump may seem like he's loose with his language, but I think there's always a calculation behind it. And I think it may be an effort to try to draw North Korea into a negotiation again. But I think at the same time, why it's an effort to try to draw North Korea into a negotiation again, I could be wrong. I mean, there are people in this room who negotiated the first administration, so they would know better. But I don't think it's in the context of CVID. I think it's in the context of the war in Ukraine and trying to do something to sever this tie between DPRK and Russia, because that tie, as your suggestion suggests, is not just about the war in Ukraine. It has much broader implications for security in the region, homeland security, Russia's role as an Indo-Pacific power, North Korean nuclear propulsion submarines in the Indo-Pacific. It has all sorts of much broader and really difficult implications. And so, I wonder whether the two of these leaders can re-engage, but the context might be quite different than the first failed attempts in Singapore in Hanoi, which were entirely about CVID. That's what it was all about. On the question on Bill's question on the Philippines, I mean, I'll just quickly say that, China might see that as a weak link to test, but at the flip side of that is that if there is a predilection for Trump to sort of try to do America first and draw down the U.S. footprint in Asia, testing the United States will be one way to pull them back in, right? And so I think there are two sides to that. On the question on appointments, I mean, if you look at the Asia team that they're putting together, I think it is not different in the sense that it is a combination of people who have both academic and policy credentials. It's a pretty good team that they're putting together. If you look at them in terms of their qualifications and generally their views on Asia, China alliances, it's quite a good team. But of course, in the end, in a Trump White House, it's Trump that's calling the shots, right? He's basically calling the shots, and everybody else is trying to play catch up. And then finally, on minilaterals, and I think the growth of these minilaterals that we've seen over the last 4 years certainly has in part to do with the efforts of the Biden administration. And even before that, the first Trump administration were doing things like the Blue Dot Network, the Clean Network, pulling together these trilaterals. And so I think there is agency in this, but I also think it just reflects more broadly the way that countries are trying to come together at a time when global governance is really under stress. I mean, the UN Security Council, for all intents and purposes, is no longer functioning. Even the UN Secretary General himself said that the UN is inoperable on the two most important issues of the day. That's Gaza and the Ukraine. And so I think what we're seeing, part of it is agency, but part of it is also just organically, states are groping for ways to try to manage the lack of governance. And my own view is I think these multilaterals that we're seeing are good and important, but they are very narrow and functionally based, and that the grouping that matters the most going forward is the G7. Because things are much more, all the conversations about global governance are moving to the G7. And it raises the question of whether the G7 in its current constitution is enough or whether it needs to be reformed. I think it needs to be reformed and it needs to be expanded, but that would be I think there's another panel on that in the afternoon that I will go and attend. So.
Great, thank you. Mr. Ambassador.
Yeah, thank you. There's a lot in all of that. Just a quick point on the South China Sea. I think there's always two things. There's the very specific dispute about a feature and how two sides interact. But the other thing we have to keep saying all the time is that it's an international waterway, that everyone has a stake in how it's governed. And I think how China conducts itself tells other countries a lot about the sort of power China is going to be. So I'd be very surprised if there was wild adventurism there, and Australia's position on this is very clear. Stability is important, but international law is the basis upon which the disputes in question should always be resolved. On Canada, which I've never been asked about in a panel before, I will simply say that I am sure the Canadian government needs no opinion or advice from an Australian official about how to deal with its very important neighbour. And, you know, as a very successful country, I'm sure they'll look after themselves. On minilateral or small groups of countries that work together on common agendas, the Quad being one of them, I agree with a lot of Victor's points. You know, there's a time of flux and a time of change. There's no obvious overarching architecture. And where there's a strong alignment of interest, it makes sense for countries to work together, to pool effort, to share information, to send signals about the basis of their engagement in the region and their views about the way the order should work. It's very easy to assess these by standards they're not hoping to emulate. That their flexibility is a strength, I think, and the Quad will really deliver a huge boost to Australia's reach and influence. Obviously, the other Quad partners will have to work out how much it does for them, but I think it's pretty clearly a huge asset for Australia, as is the trilateral partnership that we enjoy with the United States and Japan in defence, but also in other areas. So, depending on the size of the country in question, these are force multipliers. How effective they are depends on the governments involved and their commitment, but we also don't want to overinterpret them. So, you know, the be-all and end-all of the engagement of Australia in the Indo-Pacific is not the Quad. It's much bigger than that. It's just one of many tools we use to advance our interests, protect stability, and influence the character of the regional order. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Park.
Kitaoka Sensei raised a very critical question related to DP Helke, and we know that the achieving denuclearization is not so easy at the moment. But I think the goal of completely denuclearizing North Korea should never be given up. That should be there, because North Korea wants to step up on the platform that they make it a fait accompli and go further. So we have to bring back North Korea always to the table of the denuclearizing the country and denuclearizing the whole Korean Peninsula. And then, as they develop capability further and further, the extended deterrence provided by the United States should be properly kept and credibly committed. And then the trilateral cooperation among US, Korea, and Japan should remain intact under any circumstances, because that affects our security entirely. And what should be avoided is that the recklessly the putting some agendas on the negotiating table, like withdrawal of USFK or deployment of the strategic assets or the joint exercises. That kind of things are what North Korea wants. But we should be very careful in putting those issues on the negotiating table and then discuss with North Korea. That's a very dangerous game that we have to play. So rather than that, I think we have to develop many unilateral collaborative ties, not only just trilateral cooperation among US, Japan, Korea, Australia, Canada, and Philippines, and other countries can join together, saying that we have lots of friends that disagree with North Korea. And then I think we also have to talk to China strategically on many issues, because I don't know, but China would not be that much happy with rapidly developing ties between Russia and North Korea. So we have to talk to them strategically to handle the long-term future of the Korean Peninsula and North Korea.
Thank you. Wu Sensei.
Well, I think Indo-Pacific stability requires two factors. I think these two factors are important. One is the engagement of the United States or leadership deterrence is one thing. And also the other is the definition of alliance. We need to revisit the definition of alliance here. The Trump administration is criticized being isolationists. That's because U.S. want to remain as hegemonic state. That is seen from the way they form teams, because they are looking at China when they form security team. Vis-a-vis China, including Japan, we tend to think about politics, and we need to side to U.S. in terms of politics and security, but side with China for economic. But can we keep that way of thinking going forward is a question.
From the viewpoint of economy, conventionally, U.S. has played a major role in a post-World War II world with markets. But that was the way they enhanced the alliances. However, through the scheme of tariff, they are trying to pressurize their allies. So this goes against the doctrine of free economy, but post-Cold War globalization of economy has shaken manufacturing capability of the U.S. And what we are seeing is the mirror image of what has happened in the globalization. In order to maintain the level of national prowess, they need to rebuild their manufacturing capabilities as well. That leads to an understanding that U.S. protectionism that was new to the U.S. policies needs to be incorporated within the regional scheme to maintain the sustainability of this region. And that, I think, is one of the indispensable factors. Economy equals China, and security equals U.S. That is a traditional way of looking at it, but that way of thinking cannot survive. Thank you.
Keep us on time. I don't want you to think that we are not focusing on time, but I was told by the organizers we can go until 12:10, so I will not eat into your lunch break. I was told by my father, who's a pastor, you never stand between hungry people and anything else. But I do have questions that are from the online audience, so with your permission, I'm going to ask them. I will warn you in advance, they're fairly provocative. The first one actually goes to Ambassador Park, and you're not going to be happy with me, but you can blame Andrew Staples for this question. he says, referencing a recent essay in Foreign Affairs, it seems that there's a growing recognition that South Korea should or could go nuclear to counter the North. Would you comment on that, and also others on the panel who might want to join, how that might sit with the Trump administration's emerging approach to regional security? That's one. Two is from Omar. It says, the world is watching Trump policy in many areas, internally and externally. In the opinion of the panelists, does the policy of Trump bring more peace to the world, or is it actually the other way around? These are not my questions, to be very clear. So, Ambassador Park, why don't we start with you, given that you were called out, and we might bring in Victor to help as well.
No, I like the question. Do you want Korea go nuclear? Well, there's lots of thoughts. Well, emotionally, many Korean people wants to have a nuclear weapon because the North Korea is developing immense capacity of nuclear and missile capability that can attack us. And then there is a kind of simple, some people have some doubts about whether the United States is going to provide a credible deterrence, nuclear deterrence to us. So emotionally understandable. But strategically, I don't think that's the kind of a proper case at this moment. First of all, I think securing extended deterrence and making a substantial and credible is much more important. That's the reason why under this government we have created a kind of several mechanisms like a nuclear consultative group so that we can exchange ideas about how to defend Korea in times of contingency, nuclear threat. So I would say that there is a kind of, I think Victor is doing that, but if you look at the kind of the poll, the public's opinion and then the strategic elites' opinions, there is a gap. So the elites and then the kind of thing, they are much more cautious in developing nuclear weapon. So because we have still room that we can maneuver, that we can rely on extended deterrence provided by the United States, and I think that's the right decision at this moment.
Great. Victor, you want to chime in? On the second question, Wells, if you want.
Yeah, so on that first question, I mean, I agree with what Tully said. I think, and again, we've run some data on this that the public opinion is quite emotional and it's very much in favor of going nuclear. But part of that is an artifact of the way the questions are asked and everything. And the numbers are somewhere between 50 and 60%. But for the strategic elites and national security decisions are basically decisions that are shaped by strategic elite conversation, not by populist conversations. For the South Koreans, the number's much lower. It's like 30%. Are in favor, and it's like 66% are opposed. And what's important is that 66% that opposed is bipartisan. It's like a third of that identify as conservative, a third identify as progressive, and a third identify as, so it's a broad, deeply and widely based coalition. Having said that, my personal opinion is more than what North Korea does, it's really what the United States does that will shape South Korean thinking on nuclear weapons. That, in other words, I think it's much more focused on the credibility of the U.S. commitment rather than the North Korean problem, because the North Korean problem now is just internalized. It's taken as a given. It's kind of priced in as a given. That takes to the second point about Trump and peace in the world. So, we're starting a project on this at CSIS because, there is sort of the reflexive reaction, which is to say, Trump's like a bull in a china shop, undercutting all alliance conventions will lead to a great deal of instability, all this sort of stuff. But the other thing is that, what the United States does, even Trump, doesn't happen in a vacuum. Right, there is signaling that's taking place, and allies and others are going to adjust. They're going to find ways to adjust. And so the real question is the net effect of those adjustments. Is that creating more or less stability in the world? I mean, on the one hand, it could create less if South Korea goes nuclear. On the other hand, it could cause South Korea and Japan to enter into some sort of collective defense declaration, right? So we don't know which way these things are going to go, but the point is it doesn't operate in a vacuum. And I don't think we can say right off the bat that Trump is going to lead us to a more unstable world. We have to look at the second and third order effects of that.
Great. I want to apologize because we were talking about the Indo-Pacific in Tokyo, but there's been no Japanese perspective that has been offered here. So I feel compelled in some ways to end with that last question. Also, I see American representatives here to just kind of double-click Victor's point. We're only 2 weeks into this administration. I've spent a lot of time in Tokyo trying to calm the nerves. Yes, there is the stylistic questions, the way that the president says things, unconventional approaches, but I think we are living in unconventional times. And whether it's where I sit directly across from the United Nations, that on its 80th anniversary, there's a lot that's not working in the world, I would encourage all of us, particularly those here in Japan, to think about yourselves not as some type of, I have shikata ga nai just sitting here about the world, but to take agency and also to think about this as more than just about one leader or one country. This is a collective responsibility. We got to this point not because of one person or anything else, but it's going to take that larger piece. And so we should all root for the President of the United States to hold him to the word that he put in his inauguration about wanting to be a unifier and bringing peace to everyone. Whether or not he lives up to that, in some ways, the American people will have to decide, and that's part of the democratic process. But as allies, as friends, as people working in the space that want that, we're going to have to manifest that in our own way. And so whether it was the panel this morning about the role of AI and those pieces, whether it's about the choke points or the fault lines, as we heard about on this panel, there's a role for all of us here, and I look forward to continuing that conversation with you over lunch and then in the panels this afternoon. But please join me in thanking our panelists for having this rich conversation and for all of you for staying tuned. Thank you very much. Arigatou gozaimashita.
Dr. Walker, thank you very much for your wonderful moderation. And another round of warm applause is in order.